Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. This week, something a little different. We've spent the last 7 episodes looking at things that happened, documented events, dancing plagues and pig trials and volcanic winters and men thrown out of castle windows, things that historians agree took place, that we can trace through primary sources and physical evidence and the accumulated weight of scholarship. This week, we are looking at something that one man believes did not happen. 300 years of history, give or take, the entire Carolingian period, the life and reign of Charlemagne, the rise of the Viking Age, the expansion of Islam across the Middle East and into Spain, the Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid Caliphate at the height of its learning and culture, Alfred the Great of England. According to the phantom time hypothesis, all of it is fiction. All of it was invented. 297 years of documented, apparently continuous human history were fabricated by a conspiracy of 3 powerful men, a Holy Roman Emperor, a Pope, and possibly a Byzantine emperor who wanted to place their own reigns at the symbolically significant year 1000, and who therefore simply added 3 centuries that never existed, had them written into the record, distributed them across the monasteries of Europe, and in doing so, created 300 years of comfortable, politically convenient fiction, including the comfortable and politically convenient fictional emperor Charlemagne. This is not a fringe belief held by people on street corners. This is a theory that became a best-selling book in Germany, a theory that was taken seriously enough to receive a formal, scholarly rebuttal, a theory that, when you sit with it for a moment, has a kind of vertiginous quality, not because it is likely to be true, but because the question it asks is genuinely interesting. How would we know? New episodes every Tuesday at 5 in the morning. Sources are always in the episode description. Let's begin. Somewhere in a monastery in Europe, somewhere around 998, a monk is copying a manuscript. This is what monks do. It is their work and their prayer and their contribution to the preservation of human knowledge. He sits at his writing desk in the scriptorium, where the light comes in through small windows and the air smells of parchment and ink and the faint smoke of the oil lamp that supplements the daylight on gray days. He has been copying manuscripts for 20 years. He is good at it, patient, careful. His handwriting is clean and consistent, honed by decades of daily practice into something approaching an art. The manuscript he is copying today is a history, a chronicle of events from the 7th and 8th centuries, the wars and alliances and religious controversies and coronations that had shaped the world in the centuries before he was born. He copies word by word, faithfully, exactly as the text before him reads. He does not question it. He does not check it against other sources. He is a copyist, not a critic. His job is to preserve the text, not to evaluate it. What he does not know, what he cannot know, because he is a monk in a monastery in the late 10th century and has access only to the information his institution has given him, is that the document he is copying is a forgery. It was fabricated, along with hundreds of other documents like it, at the direction of men far above his station, men who understood that history is a story and that stories can be edited, men who needed the world to believe that 297 specific years had passed when they had not, men who understood that if you distributed enough forged documents to enough monasteries, copied faithfully by enough monks, the fiction would become fact, not because people were fooled, but because once something is written down and copied and cited and referenced across enough texts, the accumulated weight of the forgery exceeds the human capacity for independent verification. The monk copies his manuscript. He does not wonder whether the text is true. He does not have the conceptual framework for that kind of systematic doubt. His world is built on trust, trust in the tradition, in the institution, in the chain of transmission that connects him to the originals he has never seen. He copies because copying is how knowledge survives. He trusts because trust is how communities function. He is not naive. He is doing what a rational person does in a world where independent verification of ancient documents is impossible. He is trusting the institution that has survived and the tradition that has preserved. The year is 998. Or is it? According to the phantom time hypothesis, the year is actually 701, and everything the monk believes about the 3 centuries before his birth was written by someone who needed him to believe it. Act 1. The hypothesis and the man behind it. Heribert Illig was born in Bavaria in 1947. He is a publisher and writer who has spent decades working in the space between popular history and alternative chronology. Before he published the phantom time hypothesis in its mature form, he had spent years developing revisionist chronologies for prehistory and ancient Egypt, each book pushing the boundaries of the accepted timeline a little further. The phantom time hypothesis was, in some ways, the culmination of a career of systematic skepticism about the conventional historical record. He was not a professional academic historian. His critics would later make much of this, but he was not uneducated, and his work was taken seriously enough to warrant formal scholarly attention. His most famous work came in his 1996 book, Das erfundene Mittelalter, The Invented Middle Ages, the greatest time falsification in history, which became a bestseller in Germany and brought the phantom time hypothesis to a wide popular audience. Before that, in 1991, he had published a paper laying out the core of his argument. The scholarly response, when it came in 1997 in the form of a formal symposium, was essentially unanimous rejection. But the popular response was something else. The book sold, the theory spread, and it has been circulating in popular media, online forums, and alternative history communities ever since. So what is the theory, precisely? It begins with a calendar. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar to replace the Julian calendar that had been in use since 45 BC. The Julian calendar had a small flaw. Its year was approximately 10.8 minutes longer than the actual solar year. And over 16 centuries of use, that discrepancy had accumulated into about 10 days of drift. By 1582, the calendar was approximately 10 days out of alignment with the actual astronomical seasons. Gregory's reform corrected this by eliminating 10 days. From October of that year, people went to bed on October 4th and woke up on October 15th, and by introducing the leap year system we still use today. Illig looked at this correction and noticed something he found troubling. If the Julian calendar had been in continuous use since 45 BC, in a period of 1,627 years by 1582, then the accumulated error should have been not 10 days, but approximately 13 days. A 10-day correction would have been appropriate if the calendar had only been in use for about 1,257 years, not 1,627. The gap between those two numbers is approximately 370 years. Illig rounded this and settled on 297 years as the period of phantom time, specifically the years 614 to 911 AD. Now, I want to be transparent about something here. This calendar argument has a specific and well-understood explanation that Illig does not adequately account for. The 10-day correction in 1582 was not calibrated to bring the Gregorian calendar back into alignment with the Julian calendar as it existed when Julius Caesar introduced it in 45 BC. It was calibrated to bring it back into alignment with the calendar as it existed in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, when the Church established the rules for calculating Easter. 325 AD is approximately 1,257 years before 1582, which is almost exactly the period that produces a 10-day discrepancy. The math works. There is no missing time. The correction was for exactly as many days as it should have been. Illig either did not understand this or found a way to dismiss it. He built the rest of his theory on the assumption that the calendar discrepancy was real and unexplained. From the calendar, Illig moved to the historical record. He identified what he considered a suspicious scarcity of archaeological evidence from the 7th through early 10th centuries in Europe. This argument has a surface plausibility that deserves to be taken seriously before being refuted. The early medieval period in Western Europe is genuinely less archaeologically rich than the periods on either side of it. The Roman period left enormous physical traces: roads, buildings, amphitheaters, mosaics, inscriptions. The High Medieval period, from the 11th century onward, left its own rich record of cathedrals, castles, and documented urban life. The early medieval period in between does appear, at first glance, thinner. But there are good reasons for this that have nothing to do with phantom time. The early medieval period was one of significant population decline and urban contraction across much of Western Europe. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, people were building in wood rather than stone, which is far less durable. The institutional infrastructure that produces written records was disrupted and decentralized. The fragmentation of political authority meant that fewer large construction projects were undertaken and fewer systematic administrative records were kept. What archaeology exists from this period, and there is substantially more of it than Illig acknowledges, because archaeological technique has improved significantly since his book was written, confirms the conventional dating. Carbon-14 dates from early medieval sites do not support Illig's compressed timeline. From the archaeological record, Illig moved to the historical record. He identified what he considered a suspicious scarcity of documentary evidence from the 7th through early 10th centuries in Europe. He pointed to a gap in major construction in Constantinople. He noted apparent discontinuities in artistic and architectural styles in Germany and France. And he observed that the historical documents from this period were overwhelmingly copies made by later scribes, not originals, which was true, though also true of most early medieval documents. And then he made his most dramatic claim: Charlemagne was fictional. Charlemagne Charles the Great, crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in 800 AD, is one of the defining figures of the early Middle Ages. He created the Carolingian Empire, promoted learning and scholarship, standardized coinage and weights across much of Western Europe, and is invoked as the symbolic ancestor of both French and German national identity. He is called, by some historians, the father of Europe. Illig believed he was invented, fabricated entirely from whole cloth by the scribes of Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, who needed a plausible emperor to fill the 3 centuries of phantom time they were inserting into the record. Charlemagne, in this view, was a character in a political novel written by 10th century power brokers. The conspirators, in Illig's account, were Otto III, the Holy Roman Emperor from 996 to 1002, and Pope Sylvester II, born Gerbert of Aurillac, a French scholar who was one of the most learned men in Europe, and became Pope in 999. Otto was obsessed with the significance of the year 1000, the millennium, 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. He saw himself as a divinely ordained ruler, standing at the threshold of a new Christian age, and he wanted his reign to coincide with this epoch-making year. Pope Sylvester was his close collaborator, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer who had studied Arabic scholarship in Spain and was fully capable of understanding calendar systems. Illig's theory is that these two men, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, conspired to insert 297 years into the historical record. They fabricated documents, rewrote history, distributed the false record through the institutional networks of the church, and they created a 3-century gap filled with convenient fiction, including the convenient, politically useful, entirely invented figure of Charlemagne. Act 2. The case against, and why it matters anyway. Let me be direct. The phantom time hypothesis is wrong, not a matter of reasonable, scholarly debate. Every historian and archaeologist who has examined Illig's claims seriously has found them unfounded, and the evidence against the theory is overwhelming. I want to walk through that evidence because the refutation is interesting in its own right. It tells us something about how historical knowledge actually works. The calendar argument falls apart first, and on the same simple point I mentioned earlier, the 10-day correction of 1582 was calibrated to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, not to 45 BC. This is not contested. It is explicitly stated in the papal bull authorizing the Gregorian reform. The math works perfectly. There is no missing time implied by the calendar. The astronomical evidence is even more definitive. Astronomical events, solar eclipses, comet appearances, planetary positions can be calculated backward with extraordinary precision using modern astronomy. We know exactly when every solar eclipse visible from any point on Earth has occurred for thousands of years. When we check the historical record against these calculations, the dates align with the conventional chronology, not with Illig's revised one. The Roman author Pliny the Elder documented a solar eclipse in 59 AD. Calculation confirms an eclipse visible from Rome in exactly that year. The appearances of Halley's Comet, recorded in Chinese, European, Byzantine, and Islamic sources, are consistent with each other and with modern calculations, all on the conventional timeline. The Tang dynasty in China maintained meticulous astronomical records through the very period Illig claims never happened. Those records are consistent with independent astronomical calculation. If 297 years had been artificially inserted into the European calendar, the astronomical events recorded in Chinese and Islamic and Byzantine sources during those years would not exist. But they do. They are there, in exactly the positions the stars actually occupied on the dates the conventional chronology assigns them. Then there is dendrochronology. Trees lay down one ring per year, and the width and density of those rings varies according to the growing conditions of each specific year. By comparing the ring patterns of living trees with those of ancient timber preserved in old buildings and archaeological sites, scientists have built a continuous chronological record stretching back more than 10,000 years. This record is completely independent of any written historical tradition. It is purely physical, and it confirms the conventional chronology. Trees that grew during the period Illig calls phantom time left rings corresponding to those years. The rings are there. They always were. The Islamic world provides perhaps the most definitive external check on the conventional chronology. The Islamic calendar dates from the Hijra Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, which the conventional chronology places in 622 A.D., squarely within Illig's phantom period. The Islamic world maintained continuous, meticulous calendar keeping from this date forward, with no break, no confusion, no indication of a 297-year gap in its reckoning. The scholars of the Abbasid Caliphate, who were doing groundbreaking work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy during the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, left a record that is internally consistent, externally corroborated by the Greek and Indian sources they were engaging with, and completely incompatible with Illig's hypothesis. If the 8th and 9th centuries never happened in Europe, they still happened in Baghdad. The two records are consistent with each other and with the conventional timeline. Radiocarbon dating provides another independent confirmation. Carbon-14 decays at a known rate, and by measuring the remaining carbon-14 in organic material, scientists can determine when the organism died. Radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites assigned to the 6th through 10th centuries in Europe are consistent with the conventional chronology and inconsistent with Illig's compressed timeline. But perhaps the most immediate refutation is the simplest. The theory is irredeemably Eurocentric. If 297 years were inserted into the European historical record around 999, then either the rest of the world's calendar was wrong by the same amount, or global history would be catastrophically out of alignment with itself. The Tang dynasty in China, whose scholars produced mathematics, poetry, and astronomical records during the very period Illig calls fiction, would have to be invented. The Islamic calendar, which dates its origin to Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, in what the conventional chronology places in 622 A.D., right inside Illig's phantom period, would have to be fabricated. The continuous administrative records of the Byzantine Empire through this period would have to be forgeries. Indian records, Japanese records, Central Asian records, all of them fabricated, all coordinated with the interests of a 21-year-old Holy Roman Emperor who died in 1002 and left no heirs. It is, as one historian put it dryly, quite a feat for Otto and the Pope. And Charlemagne himself, documented not just in Frankish chronicles, but in Byzantine sources, in Islamic sources, in correspondence with Caliph Harun al-Rashid in Baghdad, and in the physical remains of his palace complex at Aachen that archaeologists have excavated and dated to the conventional period. You cannot forge a palace. You cannot plant false carbon-14 readings in ancient timbers for a future millennium to discover. Charlemagne was real. His palace is real. The physical evidence is unambiguous. So why does the phantom time hypothesis matter? Why spend an episode on a theory that has been comprehensively refuted? Because the question it asks not Illig's specific answer, which is wrong, but the underlying question is genuinely worth sitting with. How do we know the past? The historical record for the early medieval period in Europe is genuinely thinner than for many other periods. Most documents that survive from the 7th through 10th centuries are copies made by later scribes, not originals. Many of those copies were produced by people with institutional interests in particular versions of history. The church controlled most of the scriptoria. Monastic chronicles were often written to serve the interests of specific patrons or to validate particular political arrangements. History in this period was written almost entirely by people who had reasons to write it in particular ways. None of this means the history was invented. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, astronomy, dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, and the records of cultures entirely independent of the European monastic tradition, makes the conventional chronology essentially unassailable. But the question of how historical knowledge is constructed, how it is verified, and what it would take to deceive us about it is a real and interesting question. Illig's theory, however wrong, has the virtue of forcing it into the open. There is also something worth noting about the psychological appeal of theories like this one. The phantom time hypothesis tells a story in which the official version of history is a lie, in which the powerful have manipulated the past for their own benefit, in which everything we think we know might be wrong. It flatters the believer by positioning them as someone who has seen through the deception. It creates a community of those who know the truth against a mainstream that is either complicit or credulous. It is the structure of a conspiracy theory, operating on the same psychological mechanisms that make conspiracy theories generally appealing: the sense of special knowledge, the drama of concealment and revelation, the satisfying simplicity of a unified explanation for the complexity and incompleteness of the historical record. Illig is not alone in this structural approach. The Russian mathematician Anatoly Fomenko developed an even more radical version, arguing that essentially all of ancient history, classical Greece, Rome, Pharaonic Egypt, dynastic China, is a medieval fabrication, and that recorded history only begins reliably around 800 AD. In Fomenko's system, the Trojan War and the Crusades are the same conflict. Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun are the same person. The Iliad and medieval chronicles describe the same events. This theory has attracted millions of readers in Russia, where it fits neatly into a particular strain of nationalist revisionism that finds it useful to compress and reorder universal history in ways that center Russian civilization. It is, from a scholarly standpoint, even less defensible than Illig's hypothesis, which is saying something. But both Fomenko and Illig are doing something that human beings have always done. They are looking at the incompleteness of the historical record and feeling the vertigo of not knowing, and filling that vertigo with a story that feels more satisfying than uncertainty. The story may be wrong, it usually is, but the vertigo is real. And the vertigo has a legitimate source. The early medieval period is genuinely obscure in ways that other periods are not. The documents are thin. The physical record is fragmentary. The institutional structures that produced and preserved knowledge were under enormous stress. There are real gaps, real uncertainties, real places where the historical picture is incomplete, and the scholars who study it have to acknowledge that they do not know. That acknowledged uncertainty is not a sign that the period was fabricated. It is a sign that historians are doing their job honestly. The absence of certainty is not the same as the presence of conspiracy. Illig's great error was not asking the question. It was assuming that uncertainty implies deception, that gaps in the record imply fabrication, that the difficulty of knowing the past is evidence that someone deliberately made it hard to know. It is not. It is simply evidence that the past is hard to know. That is true of all history, at all times, in all places. It is the condition of historical inquiry, not an indictment of any specific period's authenticity. Act 3. What it means to question time. The phantom time hypothesis was published in 1996 and became a German bestseller. Formal scholarly refutation came in 1997. After that, scholarly attention moved on. Illig continued to develop and publish his ideas. His books continued to sell in popular markets. The theory continued to circulate in the specific corners of the internet, where alternative histories are discussed with an intensity that academic journals rarely achieve. It has never gone away. It probably never will, and I think it is worth asking why. The early medieval period in Europe genuinely is less well documented than many other periods. Not because years were invented and inserted, but because this was a time of significant political fragmentation and institutional disruption. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed in the 5th century. The infrastructure that had supported literacy, record-keeping, and the production of durable documents was severely disrupted across much of Europe. Monasteries were the primary loci of learning and record-keeping, and they were intermittently subject to Viking raids, Magyar invasions, and local conflicts that destroyed documents and disrupted institutional continuity. Many records were lost. Many were never created. The surviving documentary record is genuinely thinner than we would like it to be. This is not evidence of fabrication. It is evidence of the way historical records survive partially, unevenly, with enormous gaps that reflect which institutions endured and which did not. But it is exactly the kind of gap that a theory like Illig's can colonize, because absence of evidence looks from a distance like it might be evidence of absence. It is not, but it looks that way. The figure of Charlemagne himself contributes to the theory's appeal. He is, even within the conventional historical record, an almost implausibly significant figure. In a few decades of active reign, he created a political entity covering most of Western Europe, reformed the coinage and standardized weights and measures, promoted literacy and the arts, corresponded with the Caliph in Baghdad, and was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope on Christmas Day in 800 AD. He did more in a shorter time than almost any other figure in early medieval history. The scale of his achievement occasionally produces a skeptical reaction. Did one man really do all of this? Could this really be one person? The answer, confirmed by archaeology and by multiple independent lines of evidence, is yes. But the question that Illig's theory provokes is not an unreasonable one to ask. Healthy skepticism about extraordinary claims is a good instinct, even when the specific application of that skepticism leads to wrong conclusions. There is a specific irony in the timing of when Illig's theory gained its widest audience. The 1990s were also the years when the internet was beginning to transform how people access and share information. Alternative history communities that had previously existed in local pockets, newsletters, small press publications, conference gatherings of enthusiasts, suddenly had access to a global network of like-minded people. The phantom time hypothesis arrived at exactly the moment when the infrastructure for spreading and sustaining alternative knowledge claims was being built. It has persisted and grown through that infrastructure ever since. Today, it circulates through podcasts, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, and dedicated websites with a vitality that no academic refutation has been able to extinguish. This is not because the theory is true, it is because the theory is interesting, and because the internet is very good at sustaining interesting ideas regardless of their relationship to evidence. The deeper thing that the phantom time hypothesis touches is the fundamental strangeness of historical knowledge. We cannot directly experience the past. We can only receive accounts of it. Those accounts are filtered through layers of transmission, translation, copying, editing, and institutional interest that we can never fully reconstruct. Every historical document was written by a person with a perspective and an agenda. Every chronicle reflects the interests of its patron. Every archive has been curated, consciously and unconsciously, according to the values of the people who maintained it. This does not mean that history is fiction. The independent convergence of physical evidence, astronomical records, dendrochronology, radiocarbon dating, and the records of multiple independent civilizations means that the conventional historical timeline is not simply a story someone made up. It is a reconstruction of the past that has been tested against multiple independent lines of evidence and has held up. It is, to use the language of science, a well-confirmed theory, not perfect, not complete, not beyond revision, but supported by evidence in ways that Illig's hypothesis is not. It is worth pausing for a moment to take the hypothesis seriously on its own terms. What would it actually require for Illig to be right? Not just about a few forged documents or a few inflated dates. Those things have genuinely happened in history, and no scholar would deny it. But about the specific claim that 297 years were inserted wholesale into the calendar, with no one noticing, with no independent civilization keeping its own timeline that would expose the discrepancy, with the physical universe somehow cooperating by not leaving the solar eclipses and comet appearances and tree rings that would expose the fraud. You would need to posit a conspiracy so vast, so global, so perfectly sustained for 1,000 years that it makes the most ambitious conspiracy theories in modern political life look modest by comparison. Every monastery in Europe, every Islamic scholar, every Chinese court astronomer, every Byzantine administrator, every Jewish calendar keeper, every Indian mathematician, all of them either part of the conspiracy or fooled by it, with no whistleblower, no contradictory document that slipped through the net, no tree that grew the wrong number of rings. The more carefully you try to construct the scenario that would make Illig right, the more clearly impossible it becomes. But the anxiety that the phantom time hypothesis expresses, the anxiety that the record we have been given might not be reliable, that power has shaped what we know about the past, that the official story might be serving interests other than truth. This anxiety is not paranoid. It is historically well-founded. History has been written by victors. Documents have been forged. Records have been suppressed. Inconvenient evidence has been lost, sometimes by accident and sometimes by design. The medieval Catholic Church did, in fact, have both the motive and the institutional capacity to shape the historical record in ways that served its interests. None of this is disputed by mainstream historians. The question is only whether those well-documented instances of historical manipulation add up to the specific, enormous, globally coordinated deception that Illig's theory requires. And the answer is no. The evidence is too abundant, too physically grounded, too independent to have been fabricated by any conspiracy, however powerful. What Illig has done, at his best, is ask a question worth asking. How solid is our knowledge of the past? How much of what we think we know is based on the survival of convenient documents rather than on independent verification? How much of our picture of the early Middle Ages reflects the interests of the institutions that produced the historical record? These are questions that professional historians take seriously. The practice of source criticism, the systematic examination of where a document came from, who produced it, under what circumstances, with what interests at stake, is one of the foundational skills of historical scholarship. Professional historians do not simply accept written sources at face value. They ask, who wrote this, and why, and when, and what would they have gained from writing it this way? They look for corroboration from independent sources. They check documentary evidence against physical evidence. They ask what the silences in the record might mean, as well as what the texts say. This is not the same as assuming that everything is a fabrication. It is the careful, skeptical, evidence-testing approach to the past that genuine historical scholarship demands. Good historical practice is precisely the practice of asking how we know what we know and being honest about the limits of the evidence. The scholarship on the early medieval period has become considerably more sophisticated over recent decades about the circumstances of document production, about the institutional interests that shaped the chronicles, about the gap between what happened and what was written down. Illig asked those questions and arrived at a spectacularly wrong answer. But the questions themselves are not wrong. There is one more thing worth saying about the phantom time hypothesis before we close. It is a theory about the year 1000 specifically, about the lengths to which powerful people might go to place themselves at a moment of cosmic significance. And in a certain way, that fixation on the millennium, that willingness to reshape the entire framework of human history just to stand at a symbolically important date, is itself a very human story. Otto III, in Illig's account, wanted to be the emperor of the year 1000. He wanted that so badly that he would fabricate centuries, invent an emperor, rewrite the record of the world. Whether or not that actually happened, and it did not, the desire it describes is recognizable. The desire to be at the center of a significant moment, the desire to have one's reign one's life, one's existence, coincide with a turning point in history, the desire to matter in the largest possible way. Otto III did matter, though not in the way Illig describes. He was a real emperor, ruling at a real millennium, in a real Europe that was genuinely changing, growing, reforming, beginning the long process that would eventually produce the High Middle Ages. He did not need to fabricate 3 centuries to be significant. He was significant. His world was real. The years he ruled were real. The year 1000 came and went, as years do, and the world continued. The year is 2026. Charlemagne existed. His palace at Aachen is real. The Viking Age happened. The Tang dynasty happened. The Abbasid Caliphate happened. Alfred the Great of England was a real person who really fought the Vikings and really commissioned a translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Old English. The early Middle Ages, thin and fragmented as their documentary record may be, were real. The monk in his scriptorium was copying a genuine history, not a forgery. His world was as real as ours. No one stole 3 centuries from it. But the monk could never fully answer the question of whether what he was copying was exactly right, whether the documents he trusted were entirely trustworthy, whether the version of history he was perpetuating reflected everything that had happened or only the parts that someone had chosen to preserve. That is a question we cannot fully answer either. Not because Illig is right, but because certainty about the past is always partial, always mediated, always dependent on evidence that has survived by accident or by design. We work with what we have. We test it against everything else we know. We hold our conclusions with appropriate humility, and we keep asking. That is not weakness. That is not a concession to the conspiracy theorists. That is the honest acknowledgement that knowledge is hard, and that the people who claim certainty about the past are usually the ones who have stopped doing the difficult work of actually examining the evidence. The scholars who study the early medieval period know more about it with more confidence than they did 50 years ago. They will know more in 50 years than they know now. The field advances. The questions get sharper. The answers, when they come, are earned by the evidence rather than by assertion. Illig asked good questions and arrived at wrong answers. That is a not uncommon outcome in the history of human inquiry. What matters is that the questions keep being asked by people willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even into the uncomfortable territory of genuine uncertainty. That's what Strange Epochs is. Stories that have no clean endings, moments that history recorded but never quite explained, events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.